Hello everybody for our Wednesday program in our online workshop. So far we have heard from various perspectives, basically from different scholars, more from anthropology, more urban history, urban studies, on Hong Kong and New York. And we also heard about study methods under the pandemics. We also heard from social workers about basically the conditions of people, particularly in Sham Shui Po in Hong Kong under the pandemic. So today we have a different program element. It's basically colleagues from the profession, from Arab. And we have a longer relationship, particularly with Matthew from Arab, who often join us for crits in our urban design program. There are different reasons why I felt it's very interesting to include your office and you in the workshop. One is that, of course, it's very interesting to see also how the profession is kind of experiencing the crisis in terms of even how you work today and also what you do. But also in addition, because I heard that basically your office is also kind of considering about like where the future will be in view of the post-pandemic era, and if we don't know it's a COVID virus or any virus will come back or stay or the new normal. And I think in this context, it would be interesting to talk with you. And as far as I understand, so we have Matthew Gibbs and we have Jasper Hilkhuizen. And I think Jasper is also working on the sustainable development goals, I think, which is actually something I know from Arab is actually quite similar also what we are doing in the urban design program, that we are focusing very much on the sustainability goals of the UN and also the new urban agenda. And I think these are kind of joint interests in our work. And then I think it's quite interesting to see how you do this. No? The other thing is also because in this whole endeavor of this workshop, it's also interesting for us, maybe we can talk about this more in the discussion afterwards, is about reflecting on this kind of new conditioning of teaching and working online. And of course, it has its constraints, but also it offers a lot of opportunities for international collaborations. And as far as I know, Arab obviously is a kind of international, global operating company with offices in many parts of the world. So you have colleagues also in New York, like we are also working with our New York partners, and also with clients all over, right? So I think that might be also something interesting for students or also future practices, how we can do this and how we can study also as places in other places of the world and so on, how we can engage with this. I think it's not what I asked you maybe for this presentation, but maybe we can in the
absolutely
afterwards just have a chat about this, because that's also an important part for this workshop. It's meant to be also as an experiment for this, also to reflect about the methods, like how when we not can make study trips, if we not can go to the sites in other parts of the world, how we still can have local knowledge and site-specific solutions. But this can be just a discussion afterwards if you still have.
No, it's quite good, because we were discussing, of course, between people from the same discipline in different offices as well. And since we're in different stages of going in or coming out this COVID period, there are always discussions on what have you seen and what can you learn? Can you give us a heads up on what we should expect? Or the other way around, what happens in the US? Is it different from what is happening in Asia? And how do you deal with it? How do we deal with it? What are differences in that? And that's quite interesting to see. And I think one of the things that that we are looking at. So if we talk about cities, you know, the cities is the perspective that we are looking at from let's say the team where I'm in, and working with designing cities, long term, short term. Short term can be, for instance, think of disaster response, very actual, but long term, of course, is more the planning focused elements. And I think what you see first is that from a professional point of view, it's very important to make a distinction between what are reactionary measures to a current situation, things that come up immediately now, either coming up from the pandemic itself or from the measures that we put in place, and therefore they change our behavior, and how and if we should respond to that in a planning point of view. Then there are also more strategic goals that are initiated by the current situation and actually might have a long-lasting effect. You can see the first one, the reactionary ones, almost as opportunities that arise to create a better world, but they might not come directly from as a result from evidence on changing of cities, whereas the strategic ones are really based on long-term goals and the evidence that come out of it. And I want to highlight a few things of that. And then there is actually a last one, is that we shouldn't forget to see things from a bigger picture. We've been thinking about cities altogether, you, me, and everybody, on how to design good cities. And we should not throw everything overboard and start to do things differently immediately. And that's one of the things we should be very cautious about. So if I look at the reactionary things that come out of this situation, of course, we've been talking about supply chains, the disruption and the effects on supply chains. Things of food. Food is a very important element in that supply chain discussion. Of course, they are things that keep your city driving. That also means changing in supply chain. So we've been, in the last 20 years, changing our supply chains from a more storage-based model towards a just-in-time model, which of course increases vulnerability in cities in this kind of situation, because the connection between the product and the city is disrupted. And in this case, it's disrupted because of measures that we put in place, not that a pandemic put in place. And I think that's a distinction that we should be aware of. Other things, of course, that what is important that we noticed is the current situation highlights very much the inequalities in cities. Jasper can talk a bit more later on that. Not only in terms of age, which is directly pandemic related, but I think, for instance, also especially becoming more visible in the US in terms of race or in social status, and the effects of the pandemic directly. But what it does, it lets us rethink on how should we look at cities in terms of accessibility to healthcare, or in terms of geographical distribution of different groups throughout the city. And that actually ties in with one of the strategic changes as well, the long-lasting changes. I think one of the other discussions that always comes forward is the modal shift. We are now using other modes often than public transport. This might be a very temporal situation. The question is, will we all revert back to our original way of doing, or is there an opportunity to actually benefit from this step forward that we're taking? I think, for instance, in more pedestrian and cycling modes of transport. And can cities capture this opportunity to become a long-lasting effect rather than a short-term change in the way we use transport? On the other hand, we can see that also public transport has a vulnerability in this moment. Cities that are heavily reliant on public transport, and I think in this case we can say that we can even be lucky that the virus is not so airborne that we cannot use public transport anymore. But it does disclose some of the vulnerabilities, especially for cities, in this case, Hong Kong, Singapore, for instance, that rely very much on one single mode of public transport as a primary distributor for people to go to work, to go to other people. And this is a vulnerability that I think not everybody was aware of, because promoting transit-oriented design is one of the things that we're all very familiar with. We all do it with great passion and try to say that let's say public transport-based or rail-based cities having an advantage over car-based cities. And now I do think we should think of that also in a light, not saying that is not a good model anymore, because it still is a good model, but we should see that in a light of vulnerability as well. We see a lot of discussions going on design for social distancing. Let's say 1.5 meter parks, 1.5 meter sidewalks, etc. Should we rethink those elements in our city? These are, of course, things that are topics to discuss at this moment, but we need to see it in a longer time frame as well. Do we want to live in cities where we have parks that promote social distancing of 1.5 meter? Or is this a problem that we're trying to solve at the moment? And we might think of other solutions other than enhancing the distance or increasing the distance between people, because the social aspects of our cities are what makes our cities thrive, what makes our cities cities, and the social aspects make people want to live in cities as well. I think one other thing that we came across in terms of reactionary in the beginning is, do we need to rethink what our basic needs for housing? Where we see a trend that the average flat size in cities has been decreasing in the last decades. We also see now that that's a vulnerability that came up, and that is actually reducing the quality of our life in situations like this. So that's something we should think about when we think about how to deal with cities. That does not mean that we should try to stimulate larger flat sizes, but it should let us rethink on what are primary needs in housing projects. I think on the strategic side, so thinking a bit on the more long-lasting effects, the effects that we see evidence from at this moment, and that of course it boils down to 3-4 points. We're in a learning process where evidence is becoming more available, which lets us think on how to solve that. And one of the points I mentioned earlier is the social inequality and the geographical distribution of more vulnerable groups and access that those groups have to public services. And that's interesting, because there's been many discussions on high density versus health issues, but from our perspective, we've not been able to see that direct correlation between density in an area and increased vulnerability, or actually increased effects of this pandemic. But we do see that some of the hardest hit groups are located in the peripheries of the cities rather than in the highest density areas of the cities. And of course, that lets us rethink how we design the edges of the city. And for who are they? Are we designing them in the right way? Are we designing the accessibility to public infrastructure in the right way? And that should extend even to living in the periphery but working in the center, for instance. And how do we access the vulnerabilities related to that mode of travel? One of the other long-lasting effects, and I think that is relatively easy to see, is the value of information. And we've seen that in a long history already for a very long time. Think of the London cholera outbreak that actually could be managed in that time because of information created between incidents and location in the city. And that's something that I think in the last months that we're all dealing with this working from home, this situation of not being able to go to different places. And the value of having information actually allows us to better react and how we deal with our daily life in cities. And that's information both gathered real time on simple things like transport or public services, but also data on movement, on people, on think of disaster response elements. In this case, of course, it's those are not immediate threats that we need to resolve within 1-2 days. But if you think of it from a city governance perspective, the value of information related to health issues is a very valuable asset that has not been part of city governance in the last, let's say, until a few years ago, in the last decades. And I think the last one that we see, maybe two still, is resilience of urban systems. Cities have been moving towards centralized systems since many years. Privatization of services, think of hospitals, for instance, but also waste or sewage. If we take it out of this pandemic, but look at incidents related to other health issues, for instance, SARS, you could see that, for instance, the sewage system was an important issue in thinking about issues related to health. So I think that the point that is important here is especially not look at the last 2-3 months, 4 months only. Look at it from the perspective of how cities need to deal with health issues in general, and how can cities actually improve their health-related resilience, decentralization of different urban systems, or the reorganization of the management of such systems, plays an important role as well. And then two side issues, I think. Operational models, it's something that you already said, we're working more from home as one of the simple examples, but also for many businesses, some of the operational models might change in the future. And that will have an effect on how we move in the city, how we use the city, how we work, and how we meet other people, how we go somewhere in our leisure time, but also in our working time. So it's not only video conferencing that we do now, but it's also how do businesses operate in a city that can react in a different way to situations like this one. And the last one, I think, and that's something that not to forget, but it's not on the city scale, but it's on the building scale. It's thinking of healthy buildings. Um, of course, we are quite familiar with methods to assess healthy buildings. Think of air quality inside buildings. But we're less familiar with continuous effort into monitoring or improving or analyzing the effects of situations like this one, where health becomes a risk in buildings itself. We don't see many systems that actually allow building users or building managers to react immediately to current situations. And then I think that's the last one I wanted to come back to is the don't forget what we have been doing part. And this is, I think, maybe the most important of all is all of us have been trying to make cities better for more than 100 years. And there's a lot of thought going into making cities better. And it might not be the best to just throw some of the findings overboard immediately and replacing them with thoughts that come out of the last 2-3 months. Cities are a place of social gathering, and it's absolutely something we should cherish. Of course, it does need to be thought in light of health and cities. But we should never lose the social part of what makes our cities actually great. And I think those are the some of the key concerns. I think Jasper can talk more about the social elements of it, the SDG elements. I think these are the things that we've come across in these first months. Of course, they're early signs because things take a long time to materialize, especially to become strategic changes. It's easy to find immediate effects. It's more difficult to find long-term changes to cities that we should all strive or try to embed in our thinking about cities. Um, I think that's a summary of what we came across.
Thanks very much. Shall we ask Jasper also to how shall we do it? Shall we first open, maybe we can still listen to your part also and then open the floor for questions maybe? Or I don't know how long your part is.
Sure. No, I think, thank you, Matthew. I think he already shared many valuable lessons, so I'll try to keep it a bit more brief so we can have a better discussion afterwards. Just a bit about my own background. So I'm an urban designer, so actually I work together with Matthew, but since a year and a half, I'm mainly focusing on sustainable development, not so much on only the master planning part, but let's say all the disciplines that we have within Arab. So I think 2 years ago, Arab decided that the SDGs is something that we really think of very valuable as a firm, and we signed up or we committed to make sure that everything we do is kind of contributing to those 17 goals. So I'm hoping that all of you are more or less familiar with at least some of those goals. But what for us as a firm, we really see that there are three. This is all pre-pandemic, I should say, of course. So we already witnessed that there were three global and local integrated challenges that we face as a company. So the first one obviously is a changing climate change. Then there's something about the way we live, right? The way we consume and the way we build our cities and the rapid rates of urbanization, especially in East Asia. And thirdly is the fact that we have only one planet with limited resources in terms of the land we build on, but also in terms of energy and water supply. So how we are trying to use the SDGs in Arab is we use the SDGs, I'd say, mainly as 17 different lenses to look at the work we do. Because a lot of work we have been doing before, and it's kind of reiterating what Matthew was saying, what we've been doing before is already very good, and there's a lot of useful knowledge coming out of it. But what we try to do now is using these 17 different glasses to think beyond what we have been doing. So what for us, we always say that we are kind of mainly thinking in terms of outputs in our work. So our output, for example, is a building or a master plan, which normally is the item that is described in your brief. But what we're really trying to do is to think further than that. So what is the impact of the project? So don't just think in for Arab especially, don't think only in reinforcement bars and concrete and glass, but think about the impact of that building to the local community or to the environment. And it also means that we have to go from conventional ways of designing to more sustainable ways, and even go further again to restorative or regenerative. So give back more than that we actually took before. So that's kind of my background with the SDGs. So what we did was a quick research of how does these SDGs, how they relate to COVID and to the pandemic and what's going on. And I think Matthew already highlighted some points which are, I think, are very clear. So obviously, if you look at the first goal alone, no poverty, it's very clear that the people that are more marginalized, they're much heavier impacted by the whole pandemic. And it could be at a city level, but definitely also at a global level, right? Country versus country. And of course, the data is still coming in because not all countries have an equal amount of tests that they're executing. But we already can see from the preliminary results that it's where healthcare facilities are less developed. Obviously, there are much more cases. Similarly, of course, the SDGs that are about economy, SDG number 8, that's also very clear, right? That the effects it has on the economy is unprecedented. That now we see like an economic crisis across the entire world. Almost all sectors are impacted by this. Health, of course, is the most obvious one. And zero hunger, I think, what was very clear and striking to me is what happened in India, that the whole country is in a lockdown, but there's so many workers there. They're really dependent on their daily wages. And if they can't work, that simply means there's no money, and then there's no food. It's very devastating to see what's going on. But at the same time, we also see some positive lessons because we also try to focus on some of the good things. Obviously, there's a lot of reporting going on about the positive impacts this has on the climate. I think it was in China alone that they recorded that per day there were 13,000 flights less. So again, referring back to the topic of climate change and the carbon emissions that we have, it's a major change, and it also helps us, for example, as a firm that now we try to become zero carbon. And just this pandemic helped us to realize that actually, so why do we always need to fly here? Why do we always need to have direct face-to-face meetings? So I think it also helps us to kind of reevaluate everything that we have been doing before. So I was reading this article the other day about what is the added value of an office space. So why do we come to an office? Why is it so important? So because we realize now we can also work from home, right? So you can do a lot of the works you have been doing in office, you can do from home. So it's reevaluating the space. And then we came to realize actually one of the key added values of direct physical encounters is actually this sharing of knowledge that otherwise you wouldn't have done. It's like this informal catch-up or meetings that you have at the pantries, or the stuff you see on somebody else's desk and you think, oh, that's interesting, and maybe also it can relate to the work that you're doing. So it's really thinking about all the different components that build our cities, from buildings to plazas to streets to parks. So what is the true meaning, and how can we make sure this is being captured? Yeah, I don't think I want to dwell too much. I think what also is another very important one, I think, is that there's many big problems that the world has been facing and still is facing. And again, climate change will be a key one. But it's and we always are a little bit pessimistic because the numbers are turning and showing so bad. But then it turns out that with a pandemic like this, suddenly everybody can act. So if there's really a dire need to do something, then suddenly the world can really act, hopefully as one, to find a vaccine or to do lockdown or share the knowledge. But at least it shows there's some possibilities that we as human race, we can make a change if it's really, really needed. So maybe I leave it at that. It's a bit more high level. So it's not all about urban design, but it's really about how we use the SDGs to kind of understand some of the aspects that are clearly reflected in the pandemic.
Thank you very much. I think it's actually good to to have those perspectives, right? Because well, that's also why we link with you guys, because as I know that you're trying to get basically this kind of wider perspective to the situation. And in fact, our students also, they basically they need first to analyze a particular situation in New York and Hong Kong, then they have to see how it was affected under the pandemic, and then to think about what happens in a wider future, right? But also not only for this kind of workshop, but because that will be their practice, it will be our practice by everyone, right? So I think that's very valuable. And I also believe this kind of link to the SDG, it's quite interesting, no? And in fact, there are of course already kind of links, and I'm sure you use them also to basically, or maybe I can even show it to the students, to basically link those SDG goals, right, with the pandemic, right? And then
Yeah.
just, I mean, that's just kind of one attempt that is basically looking at that, basically re-scripting them according to what is kind of happening at the moment. And I think for tomorrow, I think for the students, they should kind of start to think about those kind of things, right? Like how we can think about not to forget all the other important aspects, not just to think about, oh, we all need to be 1.5 meters apart. This is probably maybe in 3 weeks it's no more needed, and it's just actually even maybe wrong for some moments, but in some moments we have to have the opportunity to do that, right? Anyway.
Can I add one thing? Maybe it's interesting with this slide on, is from daily work, let's say, it's really difficult to convince clients to do their projects better for the world. Let's say following SDG goals, or any other goal. Think even of any other sustainability goal, because from a client perspective, if it doesn't benefit them, why would they do it? So I think one of the things that can come out of this situation is an increased awareness of the value of some of the, let's say, the social aspects or the soft side for any project, either a new neighborhood, a new building, or a new street, or a new sewer system. And I think some of the things that came out of this situation actually are an opportunity to make a change. So if we should use this moment and this increase in attention to those things to actually make a change and make the way we do things better, because it's a long road to walk, to let clients, let's say, do SDG goals, for instance.
Yeah, I agree with this. In fact, why I was kind of while you were talking, kind of doing here some things on my screen, was basically because we are for another project that we have. Basically, we have another knowledge transfer fund project where we work, because we have on one hand this kind of activity at the moment, or initiative of the 2020 A Year Without Public Space globally, more connect with our global partners and so on. At the same time, we have a local project that is basically happening at the same moment. And one of the things that we did for this, and I think that might be useful for all of us in the discussion also, is, for example, we started to for this project, because, for example, I remember we talked about the New Urban Agenda, for example, of UN Habitat, also in your office and so on. And it's very difficult to visualize that because it seems so kind of abstract and so on. So, but what we did then for this project was basically breaking down what does it mean end no poverty for Hong Kong? What does it mean no secure food security and so on, or if we have what is the current situation in Hong Kong vis-a-vis those issues, right? So that one has actually each time the numbers and the kind of different points, percentages, and so on for each of those things to see like, oh, it becomes more kind of concrete. But anyway, I don't want to make a lecture here. But just to say, these are kind of interesting discussions that, and I agree with you that maybe this is a moment where everyone is kind of a little bit kind of set back, but also from where you can discover maybe things in a different way. Now, I talk already a lot, so maybe from the student side or the other teachers, are there any questions for our, maybe we can even do the gallery view, for our two guest speakers? Anything you want to know? Yeah, Jarun?
Can I ask a question? I really appreciate the sharing of insights from the Arab guys. It was a great presentation. I just was struck by when you mentioned resilient cities and decentralization, especially in relation to privatization. When you mentioned hospitals, for instance, as an example. So I'm just curious, what is your take on the balance between private sector and public sector? Because also, I'm interested in the discussion about smart cities and whether that actually puts too much power in the hands of private suppliers, whereas in fact maybe those kind of discussions about control of information or the distribution of resources should be really firmly in the hands of government, right? And especially when you just mentioned that you have to convince the clients. So I'm curious, like, who is your clients, or how do you see the difference between private and public clients, right, in terms of their priorities and vision for these kind of?
Yeah, it's a very good question. It's a very difficult question also, because you see that there is a trend, as far as I know, all across the world in increased privatization of public assets. Think of hospitals or transport, public transport, etc. And I don't think it's a decision by authorities to don't do that. It's they might have an influence or a role to play in managing control of those assets, but the choice to don't privatize, I don't think many countries can make. It just the evolution that we're going through in terms of dealing with cities and city governance. Of course, that lets us rethink. If we think about hospitals, because of the privatization, the number of hospital beds per person capita in cities went down, because private sector has a different objective than the public sector has. There might be quality benefits or drawbacks, both sides. So I think it is a role that city governments need to take up to enable them to have a better control of some of their assets. And this is not very common. If we take the hospital examples, cities have very little control over their hospitals, whereas their city residents actually see it as a public asset. And that the current last few months actually highlighted that issue between the privatization that has taken place in the last decades and the vulnerabilities that actually arose from that. And I think in public transport, that's one of the other things. So if you look at Asia in particular, there is a lot of private sector involvement in things that, for instance, in Europe or the US are more publicly managed. I think of roads, for instance, many of them can be developed by private sector. So it does require authorities to rethink how they can better manage control of those assets. And that can be through some of the conditions that they can impose on the private sector, either through land or through systems like many like metro companies have in collaboration with their governments, where they need to report to government to to retain a certain standard of quality, while still being a private company. So it's a different kind of model that I think plays a role in city governance.
Maybe I can share a few quick thoughts as well. So I think, especially if you talk about smart cities and the collection of data through all kind of sensors. So for us, it's very interesting because we work for both public and private clients. And I think that all of your students will do the same in your future careers. And it's very important to understand, like, why does the public or government do such a thing? And why does a privately owned enterprise do such a thing? It's very, obviously there's something about the public's interest. So you do something for the general good of the population as a government, at least you hope so. And for a private company, of course, the reason why you would measure things is most likely because of financial interest. So as a company, we try to remain very neutral in this ground. We don't choose, because people, especially in Hong Kong, they're very sensitive now, right, about collecting data and who's collecting it, how are they using it, who's owning it. So we try to stay away from the discussion, even though we might have individual opinions. As a firm, I guess we just provide the services that our clients are asking us to do, whether they're public or private. But what I find interesting personally is that, so now at our office building right here, we use automated heat temperature measurement. So for every person that's walking in, it's not with the gun anymore, but there's like a camera, and then immediately you can see the temperature of people on the screen. Suddenly people are fine with it, even though it's also very personal, right? There's also, so it's interesting to understand when people are objecting to the collection of data because they don't see the direct benefits for themselves. But in other instances, people, they might openly agree, okay, fine, collect it because I feel safer this way. Or similar as using Google Maps, I know that they're collecting my data, but the conveniences of using such a system is bigger than actually my privacy concerns. So there's a lot of consideration, I think, that go into play with this.
Yes. It's interesting, there's been so many new apps, right? Sometimes even mandatory in China, I think. If you want to travel, you have to show you have the green light from the COVID app, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
But of course, it raises issues whether that data is being stored in specific ways that it wouldn't be able to be abused or used in other ways that is maybe not part of the initial agreement. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to think of how do countries with a less developed governance system deal with these issues. Think of Indonesia, for instance, and how do they keep track of their privacy related issues in relation to, for instance, Europe, where the privacy regulations are very well developed. And that's a difficult issue because you don't know where your data is. Maybe some of my data, if I use that in Europe, is actually stored in Indonesia, and therefore it's out of control.
Right.
Yeah, so it's important to see it from not only our own local perspective, but from how can we manage that in a bigger picture.
Are there any questions from the student side? I mean, some of the things we are talking about, they are more maybe about also data infrastructure and so on and so on. Some others were also more linked to physical infrastructure and so on. But I think basically, I think it's good to conceptualize them together. But of course, you could have a question for any of those aspects. Anything you want to ask them?
Yes, I have a question. How much power do you think the government should decentralize when doing the urban design, especially some of the private?
Maybe somebody next to you. Maybe I need to turn off the yeah. Maybe the microphone. Yeah.
Should I repeat that? How much power do you think the government should decentralize when doing the urban design, especially some of the private owner the public space? How to take the responsibility in this current pandemic situation?
Let me think. It's quite a good question because, of course, privately owned public space is an important asset, especially in places where space is under pressure. Think of Hong Kong, think of any of the higher density cities. And that pressure will only increase in the coming years. So it is something that we need to think of it from a long-term perspective, and management.
Junwei, maybe you can. I muted you. Okay, it's fine.
Thanks. I think the management of those spaces plays an important role in cities. The private sector is actually providing a public service by integrating open space within their developments. But government needs to be able to keep a certain level of control or possibility to manage those spaces because they are related to the public good. So I think from our perspective, especially in the long term, with increased densities in cities, public open space in private development is quite an important asset. But of course, that cannot be only managed and operated without control of local government.
I mean, one thing regarding that, because I think maybe the background, I don't know, potentially of Junwei asking this is it's like what we saw from maybe Hudson Yards and Highline and so on. They were the first to shut down, right, under the pandemic. And we see from many places, I think, because now we organize this webinar now with people from Africa, from India, from all over the place. And I think, and again, I think that the role of street spaces as public space, in particular these kind of situations now, seems quite important because they stay open, right? Now, even because there's less traffic, there's even the potential to create more space, not only because you need to do social distancing, it's maybe just a chance to get through more space for pedestrian anyway for social distancing, but also for this kind of being a better city, right? So where potentially those other concepts that are often also bought for or through compromises or bonus regulations and so on, where billions of dollars are involved, but in a crisis they don't help at all. Basically.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So you, so that's an issue. No? The other thing is, I don't know if that's something in. You were also talking about inequalities, right? I think both of you, that we somehow see probably in those places where societies have functioned maybe not necessarily too bad, but with basically a kind of borrowed situation where part of the population, be it as unofficial migrant workers, or be it in Singapore, be it in US, or maybe in China to a certain degree, the people without CUHK, that the migrant workers, those systems, they work. If there's no crisis, they work quite well, and some people make a lot of money, and those migrants, they bite into that. They do it just as a means of survival, but somehow financially maybe might work a little bit. But in this crisis, for example, as we've seen in India, in Singapore, in probably mainland China as well, in US with all the illegal immigrants or people that are in these kind of gray zones, all of a sudden that collapsed for those people. But because of that, also virus spread also to the others, right? So it's a kind of borrowed time for places to work very efficiently, but it bites you in the back when a crisis comes, which is actually maybe, but unfortunately the people that pay are those on the bottom, right? So that's something. How do you deal with those kind of inequalities? as a consultancy office and so on. I mean, it's very difficult to engage with that, right?
Yeah, I think it's because that's something that is, let's say, common to our world, right? That we have this social discrepancy, and the way we need to deal with it from the tools that we have, because we cannot say you should not do that anymore, um, is to think about how can we, for instance, embed different housing typologies within a single block. For instance, how can you allow project developers to build inclusive housing blocks with a certain percentage of social housing um, within their development, so that allows almost a bottom-up approach of a more integrated or a more geographically not separated um, distribution of different income groups.
Yeah, maybe what is an example of how the government can kind of steer direction for development. I think for us, what is very difficult and challenging now, that okay, it's very good that we made this ambition to try to contribute to the SDGs. But if our clients, especially the public clients, they're more prone to listen because they act in the public's interest, right? But the private clients, again, they focus on financial, the financial side of the story. So what we're trying to do now is actually quite an extensive research and try to share with private clients like how sustainable design solutions actually are beneficial for them. It's not only about creating a better world, but for example, it also helps them to, I don't know, lower operational costs or to give them a better CSR profile. So more people are willing to pay a higher premium for renting their place, or just to boost up their company's reputation. So what we're trying to do is kind of identify a whole range of drivers to make sure we can have, maybe not all drivers, but at least the ones that are to which a company can be sensitive to, that we can help them to make sure that some of those inequalities can be addressed within their projects. Not because it's so good for society, but trying to demonstrate how it's good for their business and the organization. But that's something we just started recently, and it's still a long road ahead of us. But I think it's very important, and I think moreover, companies are definitely changing over time, that they're more aware of these issues. I mean, really looking at the whole Black Lives initiative across the world, and also how the corporate world is picking this up and also trying to contribute, maybe for now by posting statements on the website, but ideally also in the future with future follow-ups, simply by hiring maybe more Black staff or in other ways. But you definitely see a slow shift with those major global events in how the corporate world is responding and trying to make a difference as well.
Students, do you guys still have a question? I mean, that's a great opportunity. No, you never have questions. You guys, you should be. You don't have all the time people that can give you such insight information, right?
You can always send us an email afterward if you're, because that's my issue always with if I would be a student in a series like this. At the moment, I won't have a question, but afterwards, my head will be buzzing with questions. So don't hesitate to send either me or Matthew an email. I'm sure Hendrik can share you our contact details.
Oh, that's very generous. I must say that if I would be you, I would be rather think like, oh, I quickly talk with somebody 5 minutes rather than writing long emails. But it's very generous of your time. Anything else that you want to know?
Maybe there's one interesting thing that comes back to John Wine's question on public space or private space. So health and city is a new topic at the moment, and how the cities can better interact with dealing with health, and instead of only thinking about measures to prevent something, and you could also think on how could the city allow health of its citizens to increase. And public space, but also public space on private land, plays an important role in providing a service to have health benefits for people. Think very simple in all the Tai Chi places that we have around. Those are all, let's say, places often within private developments, open to the public. Other people come there as well, and there are definitely benefits to the community for that. So the value of those spaces is not only related to the development and the residents of that development itself. It does contain a bigger benefit, especially if we talk in relation to health issues in a city. And you can extend that even further. Think of privatized waterfronts, where people go jogging, these kind of places. So the connection between public-private and opportunities that arise within public spaces for health benefits is certainly something we should, as designers, think about.
Yeah, I think that's a very valuable point. I think I might have showed students this. We had this one talk by this funding professor in our series of webinars. So you can go to webinar 3 in May and watch it. And where it is a very nice diagram to show that only 20% of our health is basically related to health, the health sector, right? Hospitals, medication, and also there's a lot of pharmaceutical interests, right? That they want to sell you pills and so on, right? And 80% is basically environment, behavior, and so on, right? Habits. And that is so much related to the design of the city also, right? In many aspects. So where's the provision of certain kind of services? We recently talked about, for example, in Taiwan also, how many kind of pharmacies you have in an area, which was very instrumental, because those pharmacies, for example, could provide all the masks to everyone, right? Or having bike sharing systems where people that all of a sudden feel scared to take public transport can take those bikes. But this is always good to have those things, right? But in a crisis, help, but also they are every day good for your health in a way, right? Yeah. And last, seems like students, any from student side? I think our time is basically up, no? But for your working way now in terms of blended meeting in office and online, do you think there will be a longer impact of having more components of work from home and so on?
I think that there's definitely going to be some changes. So work from home, I know that because for Europe, we divided the world kind of in 5 regions, and every region is more or less free to come up with some policies in this respect. I know some regions are more eager to have people working from home than others. I think definitely Hong Kong is a bit more conventional, so they prefer most of the staff coming here, although the hours become more flexible. But I think what really helped is that, so as I guess kind of part of the commitment we have to the SDGs, we're also trying to become a net zero emissions company by 2030. So we have done a lot of analysis of where does our emissions come from. And the main chunk of emissions is us flying around the region or even globally. So, well, of course, for some projects, it's still needed to be there at present, like physically. We also have a lot of internal events like a forum or workshops or master classes. So now we're in the process of reviewing, of doing some of those, just while being in your own office. You don't need to fly to a specific location. And I think what this pandemic really helped us is to start using these digital tools. Even like how we have a meeting right now, there's no need for us to go to CUHK, right? But it could also apply to meetings that require a flight to go somewhere. So in that sense, it's very eye-opening. I mean, maybe the younger generation was already fully aware of this, but definitely for the senior management, which sometimes is not as forward-thinking as the younger generations, it's really an eye-opener to see how this new technology can enable us to just make things more easy and at the same time save money, but also save the environment.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I think also what you see, because of we had to, some of the infrastructures, let's say data, connectivity, etc., have all been prepared. to allow a large quantity of people and data to work from remotely. That's quite an interesting thing, because let's say we have in Hong Kong almost 2,000 people, I think, if I'm not mistaken. Suddenly to have 2,000 people dial in remotely just crashes many of the systems. But the fact that we had like a few weeks of head start to prepare for that allowed the company to think of how to deal with it. And now that we have that system in place, actually doing it becomes much more easy. And it also allows discussions on more flexibility into working from home. And of course, if that becomes a norm, it might also affect the way we think about planning. Think, for instance, the standards we use in determining office space, or how many workforce we anticipate to be allocated to a certain district by counting GFA, for instance.
Yeah. One last thing, maybe before we close down, if not any students or Manfredo, anyone has an important thing otherwise. One reason why I also enjoyed to talk with Arob, and there are maybe a few number of other authors maybe, but that basically there is an interest in research that goes beyond the kind of just the next project, right? So it seems like, also when we see the Jasper's work and also Matthew probably, that you guys in your office, you have actually research groups, right? That because students, they are at the moment in this workshop, and might maybe also think, oh, why do we do the workshop? And then maybe, why do we do this research? Or why do we do a thesis research? Because why not our client anyway might just want us to make a nice looking project, right? But I think that there are, of course, I mean, there's a reason why you guys have 2,000 people just in Hong Kong. Of course, many might be maybe bread, just kind of bread and butter might be, but there are also some people that really work on research strategies, right? Do you want to just say a little bit about, because those students, they might apply for jobs later, and they search for their future and so on, and how that is kind of appreciated or not in your office. What's the role of investigations, research, even if it's not necessarily something immediately you can sell to every kind of client.
Yeah, I think, well, it's always a discussion, right? So if you do your daily work and you're very in touch with current demands, current questions, let's say a relatively circular way of doing things, and to be able to be one step ahead, you need to have the possibility, and that's often outside of projects, to gain additional skills, to take a broader picture on what you're doing actually, and is that the right thing, or should you do specific things better. And Arup in that case provides the opportunity, because we're a non-listed company, right? So we're self-owned. So that means that all the funding that is circulating in the company can go back to its employees, and therefore allows us to do more research. And by doing more research allows us to initiate discussions with potential future clients that have questions that they don't know how to solve, and allows us to do more than just the daily bread and butter work.
Yeah, I think it's also important for us, not just one is to become more efficient, to know more, but also to go beyond client expectations, right? We're not just an executioner, we're a consultant, right? So we should know more than the client. So like Matthew said, we should always be ahead one step. I think also what's important to know is that the way the research is done is actually in two ways. So there's funding available. So if you work in a regular design team like us, you can apply for that funding. So to do your own research, of course you need approval, but so that will be, let's say, working staff doing it. But there's also a dedicated team within Europe that's only doing research. So the Foresight team is very progressive in that sense. So Foresight really stands for trying to investigate market trends or future drivers. So what's going to be the future of a city or of an industry or of the planet? And that work really helps us to position us and our designs for that future, and in such a way inform our clients much better, and simply delivering a better value. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Manfredo. Anything from your side? Because otherwise, I think our time is more than up, no? Because we already hold Matthew and Jasper for a while, right? Anything?
I think I'm fine with the question that been made and the answers. So I guess we can discuss it later on, maybe when we have a meeting with students.
Okay, so thanks very much for our guests. So big clap of applause for them. And so you can go back to your work. I think I told Matthew before that we are on Saturday morning, we have a review, but you don't have time there, right? But if you want to join and see like what students have done, you can, I can send you a link and so on. But I assume you are so busy with family, maybe, and so on.
Yeah, my Saturday is fully booked, but thanks a lot for the invite.
Yeah. Maybe next time.
Yeah.
So thanks very much. And maybe we stay still for a moment here just for announcement for the afternoon. So if you want already to move out, by all means, do that. Okay.
Thanks a lot for the invitation.
Yeah, thanks for.
Yeah, thank you. Good luck with the studio.
Matthew and Jasper. Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.